Over a year and a half since the start of the war, the Israeli government has yet to decide on the proper legal framework for trying and punishing those who took part in the greatest atrocity ever visited on the Jewish state and its citizens. How can Israel bring justice to the perpetrators of October 7th? I'm Aylana Meisel, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, and today we're examining the legal and moral complexities involved in this question. Join us now for Basic Law. So today we're tackling an extremely serious topic, which will naturally touch on some horrible actions that took place in the atrocities of October 7th. I think that the discussion of how Israel prosecutes and punishes those responsible is a critical one, and that all those affected, including friends and family of those murdered and those fighting to defend Israel now, have a right and an interest in thinking about these topics with us. But this could be a difficult discussion, and I want viewers to please know that ahead of time. And with that said, today I'm honored to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves Maurice Hirsch, who's formerly an IDF military advocate. He was for nearly 2 decades. And today he's a fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Maurice, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for coming. So could you share a little bit more about your background and then we'll dive straight in?
Yeah, so as you said, I finished my law degree in England. I then moved to Israel, joined the IDF MAG and spent 20 years there. Most of that time I spent in different aspects of Judea and Samaria, and of that, most of the time in the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, starting from a prosecutor in the courts and then working up to the different positions, the head of the appeals department, the deputy director of the prosecution, and my final position in the IDF was head of the prosecution, the director of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria. So it's dealing with pretty much all of the terrorism-based cases that Israel knows and has seen. At one stage, I was also really the acting head of the prosecution when, in 2005, we closed the prosecution service in the Gaza Strip. So I was really familiar and one of the last dinosaurs who actually knows what we did with the prosecution of Gazans before the disengagement.
Well, again, honored to have you and looking forward to the discussion. It sounds like we have a few episodes in us if you really want to take this talk to its proper depth, but we're going to start now with just one. So before we go into the question of how to prosecute the events of October 7th, I'd like to understand how Israel relates now to the question of prosecuting terrorism, both within the Green Line and in Judea and Samaria.
So let's put aside the event of October 7 for a second and look at the situation prior to October 7. As a general rule, Israel sent most of the terrorists, most of them are coming out of Judea and Samaria, and most of them were sent to the prosecution in Judea and Samaria. Only a few of them actually stood trial in the Israeli civilian courts, mostly cases where you had crimes that started in Judea and Samaria and then carried on into Israel. That's how the jurisdiction was bought, as it were, for the military courts. The Israeli law provides that if any part of an offense was committed in that jurisdiction, then the court then gains jurisdiction over that offense. So if terrorists were planning a suicide bombing to be carried out in Israel, but were then really getting everything ready, recruiting the suicide bombers, building the bombs in, for example, in Hebron, obviously, and then sending the suicide bomber on his way when he eventually made it into Israel, if he did make it into Israel, and was arrested. So part of the crime would have been committed in Judea and Samaria. Most of the conspirators would have been actors in Judea and Samaria, and therefore they would all have been put together. That's when you're talking about the Palestinian terrorists really starting terrorism. It was the same also to a certain extent with Gaza, at least initially, before the disengagement, when you had terrorist attacks starting in Gaza and then moving into Israel. And so that's how you found a situation where, like I said, 97 to 98% of all of the terrorist cases in Israel were prosecuted in the military courts in Judea and Samaria. You also had within that then, obviously, the terrorist attacks, which were entirely committed or mostly committed in Israel. And then you had those situations where those people would be arrested, interrogated, and prosecuted in the civilian courts way back in the late 70s, 80s, and even through to the late 90s, there was actually a military court that operated in Israel. Whilst it has the same name, the military courts, as Judea and Samaria, it's actually a separate beast of its own nature. And really, that's how we were dealing with terrorist activity prior to October 7. Mostly Judea and Samaria, some in the civilian courts. And then you had the very, very specific acts, which even started in Judea and Samaria, but ended in Israel, but that were prosecuted also in Israel. For example, if you remember just a few years ago, there was a terrorist attack in the Sarona food market opposite IDF headquarters in the middle of Tel Aviv. And those attackers were arrested and put on trial in the civilian courts, even though they came out of Hebron, and technically the military courts would also have had jurisdiction over them. So that's really how we planned it. There were all types of issues that came up all the way through. What rights do the different people have? Is there a difference between the rights in Israel and the rights in Judea and Samaria? I'll fast forward on all of those questions and say, no, there's no difference whatsoever. Whether you're a terrorist in Israel or a terrorist in Judea and Samaria, you still have a right to consult with a lawyer. You still have a right to remain silent under interrogation and avoid self-incrimination. You still have the right to be represented by a lawyer and to confront your accusers as part of the criminal process. The rules of evidence, one of the amazing things in Judea and Samaria was that in 1967, when the military courts were set up, then military advocate general Shamgar, later the president of Israel's Supreme Court, enacted the order for security provisions, and he said something very simple there. The rules of evidence that are applied in the civilian courts will also apply in the military courts in Judea and Samaria, so as to avoid any type of arguments of, well, you have military courts, so you have special rules of evidence, and it's easier to bring about prosecutions and convictions. Truly, it isn't. It's the same rules of evidence that are applied in both jurisdictions, the same rules of procedure, the same substantive rights all the way through. So really, that's what we were dealing with most of the cases of terrorism that we saw prior to October 7. And we had incidences of mass murder. Let's not forget that. We had incidences of buses blowing up. We had people like Hassan Salameh, who stood trial for a series of bus bombings and was eventually convicted and sentenced to 44 life sentences. People like Abdallah Barghouti, who similarly led, he was a bomb engineer, led a series of terrorist attacks during the PA-instigated terror war starting September 2000, and he was eventually convicted and sentenced to 67 consecutive life sentences. What does that mean? That we kill him 67 times and bring him back to life? Not exactly, but that's the way that the system really expressed the severity of the crimes, a life sentence for every life that was taken. And that was really the practice that we had until October 7.
So just a quick question on what you said earlier. Why were so many cases tried in the military courts? Meaning, why were you looking for a jurisdictional hook to Judea and Samaria when the attacks were albeit planned there, but they were carried out in Israel? Was it a question of logistical backlog within the Israeli criminal system?
No, it was fundamentally a question of when you have two different defendants that could possibly stand trial in two different jurisdictions. There is obviously a benefit to one prosecution service dealing with all of the different criminals. So when you have terrorists from Judea and Samaria, from Hebron, as I said, who are planning the suicide attack, and you've got one of the members or a few of the members who are eventually caught in Israel, to bring them together, it's a problem going the other way, taking the terrorists out of Judea and Samaria and moving them to Israel. Because you again have to prove that they themselves carried out part of that crime within the jurisdiction of Israel. So it was really passing over that imaginary green line, as it's called, that caused somewhat of a jurisdictional question. And that was the answer that we found, was to put all of the terrorists together on trial before the military courts, have one prosecution service dealing with all of the terrorists. and not split up the trial and have two prosecutors and two courts dealing with the same subject matter, as it were. And that was really the decision that were made. There were some cases where the trials were split into two, where some of the terrorists stood trial in Judea and Samaria, some of them stood trial in the civilian courts, and it really was both a logistical a nightmare, with different judges making different decisions, different timetables, and different prosecutors dealing with really the same material. Because when you're talking about terrorist attacks, you're really trying to prove the basics of what were the actions that cumulatively formed the basis of the crime that they were indicted for. And that is the same pretty much for the people who planned the terror attack and those that carried it out at the end. So the basic of each one of these incidents was the same, and therefore there was no point in splitting them out.
Okay. You're one of the people who've weighed in on this question of prosecution of October 7th within the Israeli legal discourse. And you're also one of the few that has done so in English. You wrote a paper called Israel Under Fire, Detention, Prosecution, and Punishment Following the October 7th Massacre. It's up at the JCFA website. I'm sorry, I'm still used to saying JCPA.
I know, the change of name is somewhat difficult to get after so many years.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there. The problem with conservatives is that it takes us a bit longer for things to really sink in and become habit. Okay, so we have this paper up. I encourage people to go and read it, but we're going to focus on just a couple of aspects of it, specifically the question of prosecution and punishment, or the questions. So my larger order query to you first is that both at the level of substance and in terms of the guiding law that you think should apply, what separates October 7th from even a mass terror attack that you might have tried in the past?
So I think the difference that we have to see of the October 7 towards and against any of the other terrorist attacks, whether they be even multiple incidents, was the fact that this was an en masse terror attack with thousands of participants operating in an organized fashion along Israel's border with the Gaza Strip. The terrorists, you just have to look at what happened on October 7. We're not talking about 3,000 terrorists coming across in the first wave and all going to the same place. They had a very, very clear plan. Some went to the north of the Gaza Strip, some went to the south of the Gaza Strip, some came through the center of the Gaza Strip. And so you had multiple different sites with the same actions being carried out in all of the different sites, partly an armed attack, partly murders, arson, rape, beheadings, torture, all of these things really having a common factor in most of the different sites. And that's spread out on this tremendous geographical area. I mean, it's not a big area in US schemes of things, but for Israel, it is a spread out area. We're talking about some really 30 to 40 kilometers that separates the different sites. And it all leads back to this nucleus of Hamas planners, Yahya Sinwar, and that small group of people in the Gaza Strip who had for many years planned the October 7 attack and then sending out their terrorist arms into Israel. So what we're seeing there is dozens, if not more, scores of different crime scenes, as it were, that in each one, it has its own specific characteristics, its own specific crimes, its own specific group of terrorists, but they're all part of the same, I think, wider framework, we can say, of the planning and execution of the attack. So what makes a difference really is that in most cases, you have one crime scene. It's a relatively sterile crime scene. Even, I mean, it's hard to talk in terms of suicide bombers on buses and a sterile crime scene. But really, when you're talking in legal terms, that's exactly what you have. You have a scene of a crime. It's horrific. There are, please excuse the graphic description. You have body parts and blood all over the place. Parts of buses, parts of restaurant spread all over the place. But the crime scene itself is relatively sterile. After the initial attack, there are forces that come in. they isolate the area, they can then gather the relevant evidence, they can gather, God forbid, the body parts, and they can then turn that into an investigative idea of that specific crime scene. What we had on October 7 was unfortunately very, very different. We had thousands of terrorists in different waves, 3,000 in the first wave, followed by another, anywhere between 3,000 to 3,700 coming across in the second wave, carrying out all of these terrorist offenses, and really at the same time, active military operations, active acts of war. We're talking about almost 72 hours that it took the IDF to really get that area under control. The initial parts of the attack were accompanied by Hamas and the other terrorists with the fire of thousands of rockets into Israel, onto the civilian population. So you really have a warlike situation in which these crimes are being committed, but then what would consider to be in most regular criminal investigations, some type of a tampering with the scene of the crime, because you've now got active fighting. So which of the terrorists are killed in which situation? Normal circumstances, terrorist comes, he carries out his attack, God forbid, and he's shot at the scene, and everybody knows Ahmed is caught at the scene, shot, neutralized, as they say in the Israeli news, and you move on from there. Here we're talking about a situation where we don't know exactly which of the terrorists were involved exactly in which of the sites. Some of the terrorists were killed. Some of them managed to carry out their attacks and, together with hostages, then return to the Gaza Strip. Some of them were arrested and killed at the scene. Some of them had their weapons still on them. Some of them didn't. So now you have to try and put together this forensic picture of which terrorist was carrying which gun at which site, murdering which victims or raping which victims. And at the same time, whilst we know that there was an element of systematic rape during the October 7 massacre, when you're looking at a scenario of 1,200 people being killed in under 7 hours, the first thought is not, well, let's stop all the war, let's forget all the rockets, and let's start doing rape kits for the victims. So you're already having a situation which has great complexity from an evidentiary point of view, trying to put all those pieces of the puzzle together to get to really a story of what happened on each site on an individual basis with each victim, but really also as part of that collective of the entire picture of October 7. And now you've got to try and put that picture together.
So you say the normal rules of evidence and the regular criminal system are not equipped to deal with the challenges that this kind of collective crime poses. I'd ask you also whether there's an issue not just of procedure and venue, but maybe an issue of trying to set a narrative, meaning not just a question of establishing the culpability of a particular defendant, but of really setting the entire story of October 7th. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that in addition to meting out justice to the perpetrators, we're trying to find a proper way through the law and through the legal proceeding that will allow us to tell a correct story of October 7th.
Yeah, I think we have to distinguish, Aylana, between two different parts of this criminal process. One is the basic crimes, right? The basic crimes already existed in Israel. You have murder, you have rape, you have arson, you have torture. The basic crimes exist already. It's the idea of seeing them together as not as individual acts or individual crimes carried out on an individual basis, but rather as part of this wider, I would say, criminal conspiracy, as it were. And to that extent, you're right. It is a part of telling the narrative. This isn't individual terrorists attacking different sites on an individual basis. This was a wider, well-planned and thoroughly prepared for mass execution in a very, very short period of time. So from that point of view, it's very, very similar to a certain extent in its characteristics also to the Nuremberg trials. If we look back at the Nuremberg trials, part of that idea that was put forward by Robert Jackson was to tell the narrative. It wasn't just the extermination of Yankele from Poland. It was the extermination of the Jews of Europe. It was really the calculated method in which they worked. It wasn't just haphazard. It was we will provide all of the different actors with everything they need, whether it be gas chambers and Cyclone B, or the terrorists from Gaza with their weapons, with their RPGs, and then we'll send them off to carry out their acts of terror, their acts of murder, and arson and rape. So you have that double element, and really a dominant factor of the Nuremberg trials was telling the narrative. I don't know for those of your viewers who saw recently, there was a parliamentary report put out by the English Parliament documenting the October 7 massacre. There, the author started off by saying it took a few years for the element of Holocaust denial to even kick in after World War II, but it took only hours for the denial of the October 7 massacre to be launched across the globe, and therefore the importance of documenting every single murder, every single crime, every single rape, and telling that as part of this wider attack, this assault on Israel by these genocidal terrorists. And that's something which telling the story is an integral part of putting those terrorists on trial. And so much of the evidence now isn't even related to October 7, right? Gathering the evidence to tell the story of this terrorist conspiracy that started many years before October 7 in the planning stage, in the organizational stage, is information that's been gathered from the Gaza Strip. If you remember that the scene of the Hamas computer server that was uncovered underneath UNRWA's headquarters in the Gaza City, right? That was a wealth of intelligence information, Hamas documents, which then provided all types of different information, whether it be for the military operations on the ground, but also for the purpose of telling this story. How did this all begin? And as we're going along, we're seeing more and more of these documents coming out. We saw just maybe a few weeks ago documents of Yahya Sinwar writing to the Iranians and requesting $500 million in order to carry out the biggest terror attack that Israel has ever seen, and the Iranians saying, with pleasure, have the money. And so when you take it all the way back to when did it start, to what extent can you hook in? If you remember, there was the events of the March of Return, the violent terrorist attack on the Gaza border in March 2018. And then you had, just a few days after they started, Yahya Sinwar at one of the sites coming across and saying, we're going to infiltrate Israel and rip the hearts of the Israelis out of their bodies. Now, that's exactly what happened on October 7. And so how far back did this go? Was Yahya Sinwar, was that part of the March of Return? Was that part of those demonstrations? I would argue, without question, yes, that there was a connection all the way back, going back to December 2016 from different intelligence documents that have been seized and exposed, providing the basis for the October 7 massacre, and then moving forward through the different planning stages, the dry run, as it were, in 2018, that Israel managed to repel, and then not so successfully on October 7. So that's really part of this wider story, and much of that evidence couldn't be told from October 7. The October 7 murderers were the bottom of the food chain. They were the executioners. Now you're looking at the higher echelons, and to what extent they are involved. Who do we care about there? Do we care about really getting to, obviously Yahya Sinwar is no longer with us, thank God. And so to what extent do we need to tell that entire narrative when there might not even be a relevant defendant, right? Some of those planners, most of the planners, I hope, of the attack have already been neutralized or will soon be neutralized, but it still has to be an integral part of the criminal process to tell that narrative. Hitler was dead, right? We didn't need it didn't mean that you needed or had any less requirement to tell that narrative to the Nuremberg trials. So that's part of I think, the different complexities that comes in. Where's the evidence coming from? What offenses are we dealing with? I would just maybe just correct one little thing, which possibly I wasn't clear about. The evidentiary rules that will be applied in these trials, should we get there, it's not something that's entirely new to the criminal process. There have been instances, for example, the Nuremberg trials, where you have this evidentiary process. It isn't necessarily as strict as every other criminal trial. The chain of evidence, for example, is sometimes something which is going to come into question, and it's something which we won't be able to tell, even though we might be able to identify the circumstances of the death of every single victim. We won't necessarily be able to tell every one of those stories within an indictment, because otherwise we'll have a trial going on here for years and years and years on a subject which isn't necessarily pertinent to the specific defendant. The other really critical subject here is, how do you view all of these different sites and the different actors? Are they all co-conspirators, right? Or is each individual site in and of itself co-conspirators? Or can you see all of them as part of the same criminal enterprise, as it were? And therefore, and what's the difference there? Whether who attacked Zikim in the north of the Gaza Strip can also be held responsible for events that took place in Kerem Shalom at the southern Gaza Strip, even though he was physically not there. And so to what extent can you then say that every single one of these murderers was a co-conspirator, and every co-conspirator can then be found potentially liable and guilty for all of the different attacks that happened in all of the different scenes? That has a very specific implication, as I wrote in the paper, for when you talk about the punishment.
Okay, well, I should mention, and I hope that I did, but in the event that I didn't, that what we're talking about right now is how, or rather what sort of legal theory the state might adopt when it chooses to prosecute. But I want to be clear that the decision to prosecute and when it happens, of course, is a political question and not a legal one. And I think it's also evident to many of us that the lack of a decision on what to do here so far is partially motivated by the desire to maintain maximum flexibility in negotiations for our hostages being held by the enemy. So in the event that I wasn't clear about that at the opening of the show, I just want to make sure that we say it now before we proceed. Now, you have a proposal in the paper for the application of a specific law to this event or series of events in light of everything that we talked about, in light of the aims, in light of the complications. So could you be a little more specific as to that law and why you believe it should apply or be amended and then apply? And from there, we can go to the question of punishment.
So really what we have in Israel is we have already the criminal code, right? The criminal code sets down all of these different offenses and could potentially be relevant. But when you look at the nature of October 7 and you appreciate that it was an attempt to carry out a genocide, it was an organized, planned and a terror attack, then you understand that this whole incident has a different perspective entirely. So in Israel, already in 1951, soon after, obviously, World War II, the Holocaust, the international community adopted the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide, for the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. Israel immediately joined that convention. That's why, open brackets, we won't discuss it. That's what we're doing in the ICC at the behest of Iran and South Africa, close brackets.
The ICJ.
ICJ, sorry, the ICJ. And Israel implemented a law, passed a law in 1951 that provided exactly for that. If you were responsible for the commission of A, B, C, D, E, F, G offenses in the course of this wider genocidal attack, then you could be prosecuted under that law. And that's really the law which I think is most applicable for these circumstances, if I wasn't clear enough before. This isn't a one-off attack of one individual against one or even multiple victims. This is an organized genocidal attack on Israel. The goal was to murder as many Jews as possible. And every one of those participants, having carried out their part, was an integral part of that wider criminal terrorist conspiracy. And therefore, looking at each individual case on an individual basis, as is the general rule of possibly of criminal law, isn't appropriate for this situation. And therefore, you need to look at the wider picture and implement the law which is more applicable for that wider picture. Looking at all of those events and not having to prove that he was part of the group that turned on their SIM cards at, I don't know, at 12 o'clock at midnight the night before. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what his part in this process was. He knew that as many people, the goal was to murder as many people as possible, kidnap as many people as possible, rape as many people as possible. So looking at it in that context is, I think, much more appropriate.
So just to hone in on a point that you've mentioned, there has to be some evidentiary bar linking people to the events of the 7th. So is it the fact that they were detained, where they were detained, or what's the minimum requirement for associating a person to their, to a participation?
So I think that you have different levels of evidence for the different participants. I'll give you a few of them without really an exhaustive list. Firstly, as we know, the terrorists live streamed their actions with their GoPro cameras. Many of those cameras were seized, many of the servers were seized, and we have, I think, tens of thousands of hours of video footage taken by the terrorists themselves, depicting and really documenting the heinous crimes, the atrocities that they committed. Thereafter, we have independent other video footage as well, from the cameras, for example, of the kibbutzim, from the cameras that were placed around the different areas, and we saw in the base in the army bases that were attacked. So we have also independent video footage that was taken aside from the GoPro cameras. We then have the terrorists who were arrested at the scenes of the atrocities. Some of them were interrogated, and we've seen some of the product of those interrogations being shared by Israel's security forces, of terrorists admitting, yes, I raped someone, and then my father raped them as well. And those types of confessions are then all part of piecing together this wider puzzle of taking the victims, who was arrested at which scene, who confesses to being at which scene, through which video footage we can identify exactly who participated in which incident. Just to, I think maybe as an example that most of your viewers will know, how do we know, for example, of the involvement of UNRWA staff in the October 7 massacre? Because we have them on camera taking the body of Yonatan Samararo. So we have all of those different pictures that we can put together, that we can take. We then have the documents that have been seized in the Gaza Strip, and to putting each one of those piece by piece together to create really an entire jigsaw puzzle. Unfortunately, it's a million-piece jigsaw puzzle, and we might be missing a few pieces on the way, as always seems to happen with jigsaws. But the wider picture is, I think, very, very clear, and there are enough people who can tell the story from their point of view, whether live or dead, whether from video footage, from confessions, from other evidence, from the fighting that the soldiers had at each scene. Why did you arrest this Ahmed? What did you see him doing? So all of that goes together.
I tend to call them defendants or prisoners, but yeah.
Well, they're not defendants yet, but because they haven't been indicted yet. So at the moment, they're terrorists. Some of them are being held as unlawful combatants. Some are being held as detainees. Very, very few of them are being held as detainees for interrogation through, at the moment. Most of them have mostly finished their process of interrogation. So we can't say defendants yet because, unfortunately, even though we're 580 days down, not one indictment has been put in yet.
Okay, well, that's true. So prisoners or detainees then. But you do touch on all of these issues more at length in the paper, including the question of which sort of detention has been appropriate. Do you know, by the way, more or less how many people are still being held?
So we have hundreds of different people being held at different statuses. I think we're talking about of the terrorists who participated in the October 7 massacre and who were arrested either on the day of the massacre or thereafter in the course of the military operations in the Gaza Strip. We're talking about 300 to 500 people, right, of direct participants in the October 7 massacre. That's a lot of people to put on trial.
Yeah, I think it would probably be the largest trial of its kind ever. All right, let's spend a few minutes talking about the proper penalty, which I think is also included in the law itself, but you're welcome to discuss. And then depending how much time we have, I'll conclude either with one more question or, with my thanks.
So obviously, as you might already know, I am a firm believer in the death penalty. I believe that in normal circumstances, that should be the punishment for the terrorists that have committed murders, and even more so for the October 7 participants. They carried out terrible atrocities, and I don't think that a prison sentence can necessarily express really the rejection of mankind, of society, of these types of acts carried out on such a wide scale, in the same way as the main trials in Nuremberg ended with the death sentences. So that should be the case for the participants in the October 7 massacre. How do you then divide up between those who were in the first wave, those who were in the second wave? What would be exactly the crime for someone who only I say with really with a very, very hard heart, but only murdered one person as opposed to someone who murdered an entire family? Should there be a differentiation of their punishments? Should one only receive a life sentence? Should the other receive the death sentence? What happens when you have hundreds of people who you can prove, again, beyond reasonable doubt, that they participated in murders, in rapes, in torture, and you now want to impose the death sentence? How many people could Israel, could the international community tolerate? Could we have 100 people waiting on death row to be executed? How do you deal with that? Would that be something which Israel would be able to get through and really put aside the noise of the terrorists, of their supporters, of the international community?
I wonder about that, given that we haven't really used the death penalty except for twice.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We have national trauma from the death penalty already from Israel's independence war. I touched on it in the article. And then the last person executed in Israel was Adolf Eichmann in 1961. So we haven't really had much experience with the death penalty. And to now go from almost 0 to 100 in a very short period of time, that's something which would require a mental change as well. in Israel's legal establishment. Where do you find all of these judges that are going to now adjudicate these trials if the Israeli system is very clogged up anyway? And now you have hundreds more defendants standing trial for the worst offenses with a massive evidentiary base. And then to try and get through that as we plow through the evidence in individual panels of judges, I think is going to be quite a gargantuan effort, but it's something that we need to do.
All right. So I have one last question. We sort of skipped past the question of the proper method of detention, even though there are a few being used simply for the purposes of time. And we've also not touched on, and we really can't right now, the question of the proper venue, whether it's a court or tribunal or some kind of new animal, which there have been several proposals for. But at least on the question of the guiding law and on the question of penalty, you're pretty definitive in your view that it should be related to the prohibition against genocide and that the death penalty would be applied in the ideal. And I want to make sure that we've summed that up appropriately for the viewers before our very last question. And that is, where do you think the Israeli legal system is on these issues? Because at the beginning, within a few months of the war, it seemed pretty evident that the Attorney General, who oversees the state prosecution, wanted to retain jurisdiction over these cases and potentially try them through the regular criminal framework. That was my impression, and I think it was broadly shared. So where are things today?
So unfortunately, we haven't really moved very far from October 7, despite the passage of time. We're still, I think, looking at prosecution within some type of civilian framework. There have been people who have suggested using, as I mentioned, the military courts that did exist in Israel until the late 90s. But they're pretty much extinct, and the basic laws there that apply aren't really relevant for the October 7 massacre. So we're looking at trials in a civilian court environment for these terrorists. When it will actually happen is quite a different story. We're talking about many trials going on at the same time. I doubt that it's possible to put 300 people on trial collectively. And so we're moving forward, I think, very slowly on that. I think what you said was right. At the moment, we're trying to, or Israel's legal system is trying to maintain maximum flexibility. I would say in the most defeatist of manners, almost in the assumption that these terrorists will have to be released in return for the hostages. That shouldn't be the case. But that's really part of the impediment to moving forward. Well, if they're under trial, and God forbid, if they're, from that point of view, if they're convicted and then sentenced to death, then it would be much more difficult to have this horse trading with them to get our hostages back, or in some way endanger the hostages. I think that's part of the consideration. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a legal point of view, but it's more of a political decision that's being made. Just to tell you part of an anecdote as to just how potentially messed up Israel's legal system is. We had hundreds of these terrorists at the beginning, thousands of these terrorists who were arrested at the beginning of the war. They were brought before judges in Israel. Well, who's now going to represent them? If I said they have a right to be represented in by a lawyer of their choice, the public defense organization said that they're not willing to defend these terrorists. And so what you then had was a situation developing where the courts appointed, at the expense of the Israeli taxpayer, lawyers to represent these terrorists who had just committed the worst atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. This was really an untenable situation. And Simcha Rotman, a member of Knesset, Simcha Rotman, then promoted and then passed a legislation which said that, looking at really the driving factors behind this, Israel collects money for the Palestinian Authority. That money will be, the Palestinian Authority has laws which commits itself to providing all terrorists, all Palestinian terrorists, with representation. And so what was eventually decided was that the law that was passed that says that the cost of representing the October 7 terrorists will be then rolled onto the shoulders of the Palestinian Authority. So that's the situation. But for many, many months, Israel's taxpayers were paying for lawyers to represent the people who murdered our men, women, and children, raped, tortured, in really quite an absurd manner.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of work yet to be done in this space. So thank you for being one of the first contributors on this topic. We're going to have other shows on it as well.
Thanks very much.
I appreciate your views, and I hope that we'll get future chances to talk about this and hopefully many other matters at other times.